From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And in today's lineup, K-State's Lucas Haag discussing the viability of spring wheat in Kansas cropping systems. He's conducted several years of spring wheat variety evaluations, both for yield and quality performance. Lucas telling us the latter trait is usually of the greatest value to you growers. Also today, the latest edition of FSA Coffee Talk. From the Farm Service Agency, Josh Ritter joins us to go over the details of the USDA's Direct Farm Ownership Loan Program. And on this week's Wildlife Management segment then, K-State's Charlie Lee on a new study of food plots for white-tailed deer and which cool season stands deer prefer. All that and more coming up on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
While the CDC urges you to avoid close contact, like hugging or shaking hands, there are other non-physical ways to say hello. Wave, wink, use sign language, salute, smile, give the peace sign, throw up an air high five, do jazz hands. Remember, stay a minimum of 6 feet or 2 arms length away from others and stay home if you can. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Thanks for being along with us for Agriculture Today. Winter wheat production, of course, is a longtime staple of Kansas agriculture. But our guest continues to get inquiries now about producing winter wheat's cousin here in this state. That would be spring wheat. So ahead of the spring planting season, we invite in once more Lucas Haag. Lucas is the crop production specialist for K-State Research and Extension, stationed in northwest Kansas, where, in fact, he has been conducting some spring wheat variety trials recently, and we'll discuss that. But, Lucas, give us a flavor of the level of interest in spring wheat in Kansas, as you would read it right now.
Yeah, Eric, so, really what's driving this is, guys are looking for basically another alternative to fallow. And so over the past couple of years, we have seen a lot of acres where producers have attempted to go in and seed winter wheat back into fresh corn stalks or freshly harvested sorghum stalks, and with varying degrees of success. Obviously the ground's pretty dry at that point, and that can cause us problems running an air seeder through there. We dislodge the residue, and then if we don't get a decent stand of winter wheat, we're a lot more susceptible to blowing through the winter. And the yields often aren't that great with winter wheat planted back into those scenarios. So there's obviously been interest in, can we essentially accomplish the same thing, but do it with spring wheat, and either frost seed that, December, January, February, or even actual, on-time seeding in that February, March time frame. And so that's really where the interest is again trying to look at it as a fallow replacement.
Producers always will want to talk first about potential yields, though, even as you're looking at a fallow alternative like spring wheat might be. The idea isn't anything new, Lucas, but the drawback to spring wheat has always been that yield comparison with winter wheat, hasn't it?
Yeah, and that's kind of why we're taking a fresh look at it. So you're right, though. Spring wheat's been looked at Colby a number of times. Actually, there's and it's interesting how consistent the answer has been. Now, this is comparing spring wheat grown on fallow versus winter wheat grown on fallow, which again is not exactly the interest of today, but just from a historical standpoint, there was a 35-year study in Colby, 1915 to 1950. It was looked at again in the 70s, looked at again in the early 2000s. And interestingly, the answer, even though varieties and practices, fertilization, everything had changed, obviously from 1915 to 2005, the answer, though, was pretty consistent, and that was that spring wheat grown on fallow makes basically a tick under half of what winter wheat grown on fallow would make in the same years. And so we know when we've got more water available, as we would in a fallow situation, we know there's just an inherent difference in yield potential. And obviously that comes back to, basically heat stress at flowering and grain fill is what's really going to be a huge limiting factor for spring wheat in Kansas.
And that naturally would lead us into the work that you've been doing in the last couple of years on spring wheat variety performance in northwest Kansas conditions specifically here. And you have found that moisture factor will make a difference for sure.
Yeah, so this is our second year running some spring wheat variety trials here at Colby, and so last in the 19 season we were kind of scrambling for a place to put the trial, so it did in fact end up on fallow. And our top end spring wheat yields were in the high 40s, low 50s, but at the same time we were making 100 bushel winter wheat, as well. And so but again, that's not exactly the system people are interested in. So in the 2020 year and trial, and here moving forward, we actually no-till that spring wheat right into fresh dryland corn stalks. And then in this year, and certainly we got caught with some heat. We got caught with several issues. The April 13th freeze event really set things back a bit developmentally, so we were a little bit behind. And then we ran into some pretty stiff heat as we were hitting into flowering and grain fill. And so we ended up finishing, our variety trial this year ended up finishing basically in the low 20s.
One thing, though, we must plug in here as we're talking about spring wheat performance is that one would be raising it for quality as much as yield, would they not?
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of the other thing that's maybe has brought some fresh attention to this is that, typically our Kansas flour mills do import some spring wheat out of the northern plains to basically improve the quality profile of the flour that they're making out of predominantly hard red winter. And so, obviously, if we could raise quality spring wheat here, we have an obvious freight advantage, over the wheat that they're bringing in out of the plains. And so that's kind of the other piece here. And, we've got, some local elevators that have been a little more open to committing the resources to doing that. And, we've also seen a huge increase in on-farm storage, over the last decade or so. And so even on-farm, we've got a lot of producers who now have the capability of segregating and direct shipping that identity preserved spring wheat from their farms.
And that is an essential to have the identity preservation lined up before you'd ever commit to this, right?
Yeah, because it's important to note that spring wheat is a different class of wheat, and so it'd basically be considered, if you had more than 2% of that into your hard red winter, it would basically, it's considered foreign material and would basically, eventually, at some point, you could get a load rejected from it. So it is important that producers have some marketing options, some plans lined up ahead of time. There was one facility here in northwest Kansas that has been receiving spring wheat and plans to again this year. And then I also know some producers who have had great success, segregating it on farm and direct shipping it to the mills that way.
But to further indicate that quality factor here, you do have protein readings on those varieties you tested in 2020. The average yields, again, as you said, Lucas, in the 20 bushel range or maybe slightly higher, but not much. But those protein numbers were pretty impressive, weren't they?
Yeah, Eric, our protein numbers were quite high, and part of that goes back to, for a 20 bushel yield, we had really over-fertilized. We had streamed on 130 pounds of UAN prior to joint, because we knew I did not want to be nitrogen limited to make sure we could see what could we really do in terms of protein. So that's why, our proteins were by and large 16 to 18%, which is quite high and higher than it would need to be for the quality standards of spring wheat. But I think that's part of our learning curve yet is figuring out what is that yield potential over the long term and then matching our inputs to it.
By the way, growers, if you're so interested, the performance test results from this past year are at the website northwest.ksu.edu. You can check that out directly. Then, Lucas, if we have somebody out there intrigued by the idea or curious about spring wheat production, the actual management, the seeding dates, seeding rates, and so forth. You mentioned February and March is seeding time. Anything more specific here as far as those guidelines?
Well, certainly I think we want to be earlier rather than later, and even we've got some producers looking at frost seeding, and in fact, Rob Aiken here at the Colby station looked at some of that back in the 2000s where they were planting spring wheat even into December, I believe it was. And so that can be an effective option if the ground conditions allow us to get out there and do a nice job of seeding it. Certainly the early part of March is where we want to be, or into February, into the early part of March, and just recognize that, the later planting, the more we're putting that crop at risk to heat stress during that critical flowering and grain fill stage.
And the seeding rate side of it, you actually conducted a trial last year there at Colby as well on that angle.
Yeah, so this last year we ran a trial we went from 750,000 on up to 2 million live seed per acre, and basically this year's just 1 year data is all we've got, and it's a very flat response. Which, when you're talking about raising 20 bushel wheat, 750,000 is probably enough to get you there. And so again, it's kind of like the protein nitrogen deal. I think we're still figuring out what is the range of yield potentials in our environment. I think it's worth noting that with spring wheat, we've got less window of opportunity to set tillers, and those tillers definitely are going to really struggle to be productive with our late season stress. And so I still think we probably need to be keeping those seeding rates. I'd feel a lot more comfortable if we keep those seeding rates closer to 1.5 million seed per acre until we get a better feel for things.
Your work is concentrated, of course, in northwest Kansas again. The geographical viability of spring wheat in the state, though, what is your thinking on that beyond that region?
Yeah, so I think we're certainly pushing the boundaries here, Eric, and I think back to our work with some of our other spring crops, spring pea, spring canola. I do think we're probably pushing the boundaries in terms of how far south we can go. I think it's going to be a real tough sell, maybe south of Highway 96 or something like that, or maybe even I-70. I don't know where that line is, simply, again, back to this, to the heat stress issues. But as we think about, certainly along the Highway 36 corridor, the northern couple tiers of counties, I think that's probably where our greatest chance for success lies.
Well, you have some information that you've collected recently, and there's that body of information extending actually decades back on spring wheat productivity, at least in the northern reaches of the state, and you'd invite producers who have curiosity about this to study the prospect pretty closely before committing to it, Lucas?
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to start with some limited acres and get things lined up with a marketing point and have a plan for what you're going to do with it.
Again, northwest.ksu.edu. Click on the crop production link there, and that'll take you right to Lucas's information on spring wheat productivity in Kansas based on his field trials, testing that option out. And we always appreciate the input, Lucas.
You bet, Eric.
Lucas Haag, he's the Research and Extension Crop Production Specialist for Northwest Kansas. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Next up for you on Agriculture Today, our regular update for you from the Farm Service Agency, state headquarters for Kansas here in Manhattan. It's called FSA Coffee Talk. This time around, to introduce to you somebody who's taken over a new role within that office. He is Josh Ritter, and he's been appointed as the new Farm Loan Chief for the FSA here in Kansas. So, Josh, congratulations on the new assignment. Thanks for joining us, and let folks know a bit about yourself before we go any further.
Yeah, sure. Born and raised on a farm in Wichita County near Marienthal, Kansas, which is a small little unincorporated town of about 90 people or so. My dad's operation, it's mainly dry land crop operation that consists of wheat, corn, and milo. After that, I went and got a degree at Fort Hays State University, and then for better or worse, I went to KU and got a degree as well. Then after that process was over, I started my career with FSA as a loan officer in Western Kansas almost 13 years ago. After I got done working in Western Kansas, a position opened up in the state office about 8 years ago as a loan specialist, and I took that opportunity and moved here with my family. And then about 2 months ago, I had the opportunity to become the farm loan chief here in the state office. So I took that and I'm hopefully running with it. So.
You're familiar with the ropes out there, so yeah. Smooth transition in all likelihood.
Yeah, I think it's going okay until somebody tells me different, I suppose.
Very well. Good to have you on board and joining us in this series from time to time as we look forward. Now, the Farm Service Agency does offer that variety of loan programs to agricultural producers, and you have a specific option that you'd like to discuss with us today.
Yeah, today I'd like to talk to the listeners a little bit about our direct farm ownership program. Under this direct loan program, FSA provides funding directly to our borrowers. One thing to remember is that FSA is not a competitor with commercial lenders. However, if a farm operator is unable to obtain commercial credit through a lender, then our direct program could be an option for them.
Well, then, the orientation of the direct farm ownership program, what it will support. Fill us in with some details.
Sure, yeah. FSA's direct farm ownership program is primarily used to purchase farm or pasture land or to make capital improvements to a farm. Those capital improvements can include construction, purchase or improvement of a farm dwelling, service building, or other facilities essential to the farming operation. The maximum loan amount under that program is currently $600,000, and the maximum loan term is up to 40 years, depending on the useful life of the security and the customer's repayment ability. Under the direct farm ownership program, FSA can finance 100% of a purchase, so there's no down payment necessary. The current interest rate for the program is 2.625%, and the interest rate for that program is adjusted monthly, but once a loan is approved and closed, the interest rate is fixed for the life of the loan.
So those are some of the terms. If one's interested in applying for one of these FSA direct farm ownership loans, then, Josh, what are some of the main things that folks need to have in mind as far as their eligibility for such a loan?
Sure. There are several eligibility criteria that producers will need to work through with their local farm loan program office, but a couple general thoughts to keep in mind are if a producer can't obtain sufficient credit elsewhere for the purchase at reasonable rates and terms, then the producer will not be eligible for a direct loan through FSA. We'll also look at credit history and credit worthiness and a few other things, but specifically for the direct farm ownership program, the producer must have participated in the business operations of a farm for at least 3 out of the last 10 years prior to the date the application was submitted to be eligible. The 2018 Farm Bill did make some fairly significant changes to this farm experience requirement. Specifically, 2 of the 3 years of farm experience required can be substituted with other types of experiences.
Such as?
Yeah, one thing is if the applicant has at least 16 credit hours of post-secondary education in agriculture business, horticulture, animal science, agronomy, or any other agriculture-related fields, or if the applicant has significant business management experience with at least 1 year of management experience in a non-agriculture related field where the applicant's day-to-day responsibilities included direct management experience, or if the applicant has been honorably discharged from the armed forces of the United States, or if the applicant has at least 1 year experience as a hired farm laborer with substantial management responsibilities, if the applicant has successfully completed a farm management curriculum offered by a cooperative extension service, community college, and adult vocational agriculture program, a nonprofit organization or a land-grant college or university, if the applicant successfulully completed a farm mentorship or internship program with an emphasis on management requirements and day-to-day farm management decisions. If the applicant successfully repaid a FSA youth loan, they can substitute that for 1 year. Or if the applicant has an established relationship with a retired farmer or rancher that is participating as a counselor in the Service Corps of Retired Executives program under the Small Business Act.
So there's a fair amount of latitude there, isn't there?
Yeah, and there is. And a lot of these substitutions were enacted by Congress to allow the direct farm ownership program to be more accessible to some of those individuals that did have a good background but couldn't quite meet that 3-year experience in the last 10 years. I do want to note that only 2 of the 3 years can be substituted, so there is going to have to be at least 1 year where that applicant has been in the management experience of the farm.
All right. Well, the FSA's intent here, and this has been discussed many times over, is to help those borrowers build relationships with those area financial lenders. So this farm ownership loan program, how does it lend to that objective here of working with commercial lenders?
Yeah, you're right, Eric. One of our primary goals is to definitely have our borrowers build a relationship with commercial lenders. Under our direct farm ownership program, there are 2 types of loans where FSA and the lender work together to provide financing for a real estate purchase. First, we have our joint financing loans, and under this program, FSA and a commercial lender split the financing of a loan 50-50. FSA's loan will have an interest rate of 2.5% and can be termed out to 40 years if necessary. The lender will set the rates and terms for their portion of the financing. The other program available is our down payment program. This program is for beginning farmers and minority or women farmers. And under the down payment program, the applicant will be responsible for a 5% cash down payment. FSA will provide financing on 45% of the purchase, and a commercial lender will finance the remaining 50%. FSA's loans will have a 1.5% interest rate and a 20-year term, while the loan made by the lender must have an amortization period of at least 30 years.
A number of particulars here. Of course, folks can discuss all of this with local FSA personnel that are assigned to the loan program. Josh, again, there is some flexibility to this program, but there are stipulations to be met. So the general turnaround time on processing one of these farm ownership loans, how would you characterize that?
Yeah, regulation-wise, once we get a complete application, we're supposed to make a decision within the 30-day time frame, and usually we meet that pretty easily, depending on there are some situations where we maybe need some special information, but generally I think we do a pretty good meet in that time frame. A couple things that might hold it up a little bit are waiting for an appraisal to be done on the real estate purchase, which usually if we get it ordered early in the process, will only take about 30 days, so it kind of falls in that time frame too. Also, if we are dealing with construction and new ground disturbance, we do have to do an environmental review, and that can lead to consultations with like the Native American tribes, and that can add some time to it. But generally in that 30 to 45 day time frame, we can have a decision and get everything done and have the loan closed.
So nothing out of the ordinary,
right.
Basically.
Yeah.
It moves along fairly swiftly.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up here, anything else you'd like to share about making this happen, Josh?
Yeah, just a quick reminder to everybody that all of our USDA service centers are being affected by COVID-19 still and are in various states of reopening. I would encourage potential customers or producers or applicants to contact their local offices by phone to see what stage of reopening that office is in and whether or not a producer can be allowed in the building at the time. Our offices have made great adjustments to serve our producers during these unprecedented times, and I would also like to thank our producers for their patience and understanding as we try to navigate through this pandemic still.
You bet. Well, once again, it's called the Direct Farm Ownership Program out of the USDA through the Farm Service Agency. It has some possibilities, to be sure, for those who are looking to make certain improvements on their operation or, in fact, to purchase land for an operation. Do discuss it with your local FSA personnel as you can get with them, as the protocols would be allowing locally. And we appreciate having you over. Josh, looking forward once again to working with you on USDA farm loan matters. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Eric.
He is the newly appointed Farm Loan Chief with the Farm Service Agency, State Office for Kansas. Josh Ritter with us on this latest edition of FSA Coffee Talk. Just to take us up to the break, a tad more information for you. The USDA has announced the loan interest rates for all of its programs for February. Direct farm operating loans at 1.375%, the so-called micro farm operating loans at 5%, and USDA emergency loans at 2.375%. The FSA also offers guaranteed loans, of course, through commercial lenders at rates set by those lenders. And as we mentioned on an earlier broadcast, the FSA provides low-interest financing to producers wanting to build or upgrade on-farm commodity storage facilities and or purchase handling equipment. For 3-year loans there, an interest rate of 0.25%, 5-year loans 0.375%, 7-year loans 0.75%, and 10-year loan terms right at 1%. Again, you can explore all available options on FSA loans at fsa.usda.gov or once more by touching base with your local USDA Service Center. We'll be back with more. This is Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social-economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today, broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson with you. And next up, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, farmers largely missed out on the first round of Paycheck Protection Program loans, but a change in how calculations are made for producers could result in more substantial payments now. The first round tabulated payments based on farmers' net income. That number is often low or negative because of the amount of depreciation that producers claim on equipment. Well, for 2021, producers can use their gross income to apply. Farmers and small businesses can apply for PPP loans through their traditional lenders, banks and farm credit institutions included. Those loans are forgivable as long as 60% or more of the proceeds are spent on approved expenses, which includes self-employment compensation for sole proprietorships and single-owner limited liability corporations that file income taxes based on a Schedule F. Partnerships, C corporations, and S corporations are subject to a different set of rules for owner compensation there. Under the updated provisions passed by Congress last December, that money will not be taxed as income, and it won't affect the deductions one can take. Under the reauthorized and expanded PPP, there are 3 funding options for farmers. First draw loans available for farmers that did not apply last year. Farmers that did receive a PPP loan in 2020 can apply for an increase using the new calculation as long as they have not already completed the forgiveness process. And farmers that received a first draw loan in 2020 can apply for a second draw loan, but they must show a 25% decline in receipts for 1 quarter of 2020 compared to the same time in 2019. Farmers can apply for second draw loans even if their previous loan did not qualify for forgiveness. To note, the original PPP expired back in August with more than $134 billion going unclaimed. Congress has allocated $284 billion for the reauthorized program. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Marketing Service is now seeking nominees for the United Sorghum Checkoff Program Board to fill 4 vacant producer positions, including 2 to represent Kansas, 1 to represent Texas, and 1 at-large position. Members will serve 3-year terms beginning December of 2022 and ending December of 2025. The deadline for nominations is April the 11th. Any U.S. sorghum producer who owns or shares in the ownership and risk of loss of sorghum can be considered for the nomination. The USDA Secretary will select individuals from the nominations submitted by the certified producer organizations. The 13-member United Sorghum Checkoff Program Board was established to maintain and expand the market for sorghum. For more information about it and the nomination process, go to sorghumcheckoff.com. This is Agriculture Today, and now on to our weekly feature for you dairy producers, Milk Lines. And standing by, as usual, is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning the cold weather we've been having and the impact that has likely had on your dairy herd. Many times we're never exposed to the extremes that we've seen here in the last week or so. One of the things we need to be really concerned about is the teat ends on our dairy herd. You see, when we get this type of cold, it's very possible that we're going to see some frostbite on the teat ends. This happens for a variety of reasons, but here are some things just to keep in mind. Normally, when wind chills drop to around 0, we can start to see some negative impacts on the teat ends of the cows. And we may run into some situations where, due to extreme times of exposure, that we start to see some frostbite, simply chapping of the teat ends. However, when the wind chill drops down to negative 25 or below, we're very likely to be in a situation where we are going to see some incidences of frostbite on the teat ends. Now, how can you avoid that, and what can you do after that happens? Well, a couple things on avoiding. One of the things we need to do is make sure that when the cows exit the barn, they have dry teat ends. This is an issue when we're using post dips. Again, you can use many different types of post dips, and some of those actually have a high level of emollient in them. That would be skin conditioners, and generally we were looking for 50% or more of the teat dip to actually be a skin conditioner. Now, what does that do for us? Well, number one, it helps keep that teat skin nice and soft and supple. And if that is the case, then it's less likely to crack and chap. The other thing that many of these have is that they actually dry very quickly. Differences in the formulation so that the teat ends do not stay wet for a long time. And then finally, on some of our dairies, we'll actually wipe those teat ends after the post-dipping process. Now, let's talk about the fact that we've been through this really, really cold weather. Likely we've had some negative impacts on the teat ends in our dairy herds, so what are we going to do now? One of the best things that you can probably do is utilize a post-dip after milking that has a lot of skin conditioners in this. I realize this is going to be more expensive than what you probably use most of the year, but it's really, really important that we do these things to ensure that the teat ends heal up quickly. Because when we start to get rough teat ends, this is what we sometimes call hyperkeratinosis. The skin reacts to the insult that it's been through, and it starts to grow rapidly. These teat conditioners that are in these post-dips will help this hyperkeratinosis decrease over time. Another thing you can do is work with your milkers. How they treat the teat ends as they prep cows is pretty important. As we prep cows, we want to wipe off the pre-dip. We want to wipe down with a twisting motion. Then the second wipe actually is across the teat ends. What you're trying to do is trying to remove that keratin deposit that's ready to come off. It will, over time, break off from the other skin that is there. Just think about your lips after they get chapped. That rough, dry skin eventually does peel off or come off. Same thing happens on the teat ends. So this wiping motion across the end of the teats will actually increase the speed at which that's removed, and this will decrease the amount of bacteria that might have access to the end of the teats. And the result of this hopefully will be less chance of mastitis in your dairy herd. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, reminding dairy farmers that if we've had insults to the teat ends due to the extreme cold weather, there are things that we can actively do to help those teat ends recover from that insult.
Thanks, Mike, and we'll be back with more for you. This is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and again, it's our time to talk wildlife management with former K-State wildlife specialist Charlie Lee. Mike's side. Interesting new study you're going to share with us today, Charlie, on the diet selection of white-tailed deer as they would graze food plots, and obviously we have quite a bit of that planting activity in Kansas to attract deer.
Yes, this is the time of year that people are thinking about planting cool season food plots. Some food plots are planted in the fall. Some are frost seeded or broadcast spread on top of snow, freezing thaw action to try to get good seed soil contact and germination. But I think it's important because I'm asked many times, what is the very best food plot seed that's out there? What do deer prefer? There's been lots of studies that looked at deer food preferences. This is one that focused primarily on the cool season food plots, seeds that are common agronomic crops. The study was done at Mississippi State University. They used a research property there, planting monoculture plots of 15 cool season plants that vary in nutritional composition. Each plot was about 0.02 of a hectare in size, and it was protected from deer grazing early on by electric fencing. These 15 common cool season crops were primarily clovers: Ladina white clover, Durana white clover, crimson clover, arrowleaf clover, balansa clover, berseem clover, red clover, winter wheat, oats, rye, rape, turnips, ryegrass, and Australian winter peas.
Several of which could be grown and are in Kansas.
Yes, many of those are seeds that deer managers utilize here in Kansas, and frankly get good acceptance of those crops most times. The design was to keep the deer off of the plots to allow the plots to get established, because once deer move into a spot, if the food plot is too small, they simply graze it down completely, and it never gets a chance to get tall enough to do them as much good as you would hope. Then the electric fencing was removed. Deer had access to the plots. They also set up motion cameras so that they could tell with a motion camera by each plot, so they could tell number of deer that were grazing in each plot, so they got an idea of grazing pressure. They collected that information. They also had grazing cages set up so they could measure biomass that was produced without grazing from wildlife species, including deer. And then they put the fence back up and kept deer out so that the seeds that were perhaps a little later in maturing would have a time to mature, and then did the process over. They collected nutrient data from plant clippings 6 times each year for 2 consecutive years.
And what time of year, again, were they measuring this grazing activity?
It varied. They first measured grazing activity starting in February, and then it was monthly until June. So at 6 times a year, they looked at the number of deer feeding on the plots and the composition of those particular crops. They collected 13,000 photographs that had more than 18,000 deer in those images, so they had lots of deer to work with in this particular study. 54% of those deer were classified to be in the feeding posture, and that was what was important. They didn't want deer that just crossed one plot to get to another, so they wanted deer feeding in those plots. And they had at least 100 images in all plots.
Then to the final results here, what did they discover about those types of cover and what deer prefer?
Well, the diet selection was positively influenced by a potentially limited nutrient, for example, crude protein, and it was negatively influenced by a potentially toxic nutrient, sulfur. When you looked at the crops out there, those that had the highest crude protein, which would have been Balanza clover, Durana clover, Ladino clover, red clovers, those were all high in crude protein, high in digestibility, and seemed to be selected. Some of the other crops that would be the brassicas, which would be rape and turnip, were not selected. They also had some of the highest concentrations of sulfur. Chicory, which would be in the sunflower family, was also in there with high concentrations of sulfur, which they tended to avoid. Deer likely increased selection of those plants as the fiber in those plants decreased. Those people that raise livestock in Kansas realize that fiber is a measure of forage bulkiness, and it's negatively correlated with intake. So in this particular study, plants with high in crude protein, high digestibility seemed to be what deer preferred, and that varied depending upon the time of the year. When you looked at a graph of some of those plots and the nutrient composition, for instance, of a Ladino clover got crude protein as high as 23% at the time. That would have occurred about in June. In an early time in February, that crude protein level may have been as low as 14%. Looking at oats, crude protein started out there in February at about 10%, jumped up to about 17% later in March, and then dropped back off down into 4 and 5% in June. Turnips really starts off high. Early in February, you got crude protein about 22-23%, drops off in the middle of the growing season, and by June and July, it's way down to 3 or 4% crude protein.
When you boil it all down, it sounds as if the path to follow here in putting in a food plot for deer would be something that's high protein, low sulfur.
That would be a good selection. I always encourage people to not put in a sole variety or crop selections, to use a mixture. You want to have the food plots out there that are designed to match that crude protein at high levels at all seasons of the year, just not the highest crude protein in one month, but have enough diversity, if you will, that they have the options to pick the highest quality nutrients with the highest digestibility at all of the seasons when you expect them to be grazing.
Well, this a new study again out of Mississippi State University, and its findings provide good guidance on the types of food plots that white-tailed deer prefer to graze. And we appreciate you going over it with us, Charlie. Thank you. Former wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. Our time's away once again. Thanks to you for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.